Hey there, gardeners and green thumbs. Welcome back to Botanic Haven, your go-to place for all things gardening, plant care, and creating those beautiful green spaces both indoors and out. Today we're diving into something really special: growing grapes. Whether you've got a sprawling backyard vineyard or just a couple of vines on a sunny fence, I'm going to share 9 incredibly helpful tips that'll help you get those gorgeous big grape clusters and a harvest so rich you'll be making juice, jam, and maybe even your own wine. So grab a cup of coffee or tea, get comfortable, and let's talk grapes. You know, grapes have this magical quality about them. They're one of those fruits that can transform a simple garden into something that feels almost Mediterranean, even if you're nowhere near the coast. I remember visiting my neighbour Daisy last summer, and she had these stunning grapevines cascading over her pergola. The clusters were so heavy and full that they looked like something out of a painting. She told me it hadn't always been that way. Her first few years of growing grapes were pretty disappointing, with small, sparse clusters that barely seemed worth the effort. But once she learned a few key tricks and really understood what her vines needed, everything changed. That's what I want to share with you today, the kind of practical, real-world advice that actually makes a difference. Let's start with something fundamental that so many people overlook: choosing the right grape variety for your climate. This might sound obvious, but you'd be surprised how many gardeners get excited about a particular type of grape they saw at the market or heard about from a friend, only to plant it and watch it struggle year after year. Grapes are incredibly diverse, and different varieties have evolved to thrive in specific conditions. If you live in a cooler climate with shorter summers, you'll want to look at varieties like Concord, Marquette, or Frontenac. These are bred to handle cold winters and shorter growing seasons. On the flip side, if you're in a hot, dry area, varieties like Thompson Seedless, Flame Seedless, or Muscadine grapes will be much happier. The secret is matching your environment to the grape's natural preferences, because when you do that, half the battle is already won. I knew a gardener named Oliver who lived in northern Minnesota, and he kept trying to grow European wine grapes because he loved the idea of making his own Cabernet. Year after year, his vines would either die back completely in winter or produce these tiny, sour clusters that weren't good for much of anything. Finally, someone suggested he try Marquette, which is a cold, hardy hybrid specifically developed for northern climates. The difference was like night and day. Suddenly, his vines were thriving, producing beautiful clusters, and he was actually making wine that people wanted to drink. The lesson? Work with your climate, not against it. Check your hardiness zone, talk to local grape growers or extension offices, and find out what varieties have a proven track record in your area. It'll save you years of frustration. Now, once you've got the right variety selected, let's talk about planting location and soil preparation, because this is where you're really setting yourself up for success or struggle. Grapes absolutely love full sun. We're talking at least 6 to 8 hours of direct sunlight every single day. They're sun worshippers through and through, and in shadier spots they'll grow weak, produce fewer flowers, and give you disappointing harvests. Find the sunniest spot in your yard, preferably on a south-facing slope if you have one, because that maximizes sun exposure and helps with drainage. Speaking of drainage, this is critical. Grape roots hate sitting in waterlogged soil. If your soil tends to stay soggy after rain, you've got to address that before planting. You can create raised beds, add lots of organic matter to improve soil structure, or even install drainage tiles if the problem is severe. The soil itself should be reasonably fertile, but not overly rich. This might surprise you, but grapes actually produce better when they're not swimming in nitrogen. Too much nitrogen creates lots of leafy growth but fewer grape clusters, and the grapes you do get tend to be more susceptible to disease. I've seen gardeners who treated their grapevines like tomatoes, loading them up with rich compost and nitrogen fertilizer, and they ended up with these massive green jungles that produced hardly any fruit. A better approach is to start with decent garden soil. Maybe add some compost for structure and trace nutrients, but keep it moderate. Your soil pH should ideally be between 5.5 and 7.0, slightly acidic to neutral. If your soil is way outside that range, you might need to amend it with lime to raise pH or sulfur to lower it. Before we go further, I want to pause here for just a moment. If this guide has helped you, write 1 in the comments, and if not, write 0. This way, I'll know which tips are most useful for your garden. Your feedback really does help me understand what's working and what you'd like to see more of in future videos and posts. Alright, so you've chosen your variety and prepared your planting site. Now let's get into one of the most important tips for getting bigger clusters and a richer harvest: proper pruning. I'm not going to sugarcoat this. Pruning is where a lot of people get nervous, and I understand why. There's something intimidating about taking a sharp pair of shears and cutting away what looks like perfectly good growth. But here's the truth. Grapes produce fruit on 1-year-old wood, meaning the canes that grew last season. If you don't prune, your vine becomes an overgrown mess, and it puts all its energy into producing leaves and wood instead of grapes. The clusters you do get will be small and sparse because the plant is spreading its resources too thin. There are different pruning systems depending on how you're training your vines, whether you're using a trellis, an arbor, a fence, or traditional vineyard stakes and wires. But the basic principle remains the same. During the dormant season, usually late winter or very early spring before buds start to swell, you need to cut back hard. I mean really hard. For most table grape varieties, you're removing about 90% of last year's growth. That sounds extreme, but it focuses the plant's energy on producing fewer but much larger and better quality grape clusters. You'll keep your main trunk or cordons and select just a few canes with good bud spacing to keep as your fruiting wood for the coming season. Everything else gets cut away. I remember Rose, a gardener in my community, telling me she couldn't bring herself to prune her grapevines heavily for the first 3 years. She'd trim them lightly, taking off maybe 30% of the growth because it felt less destructive. Her vines grew enormous, covered her entire arbor, and looked impressive. But the grape clusters? Tiny. Disappointing. Finally, she attended a local pruning workshop and learned to be more aggressive. The next winter, she followed the instructor's advice and cut back hard, leaving just the framework and a handful of well-spaced canes. She said it looked like she'd butchered her beautiful vines and she almost regretted it. But come summer, her grape clusters were twice as large as they'd ever been, and she harvested 3 times as much fruit. She was a true believer after that. The key is understanding that grapevines have incredible vigor. They want to grow. Your job as the gardener is to channel that vigor into fruit production rather than endless vegetative growth. Don't be timid. Learn the basics of your chosen training system, whether it's cane pruning, spur pruning, or a hybrid method, and commit to it. The rewards are absolutely worth it. Let's move on to another critical factor: consistent watering, especially during key growth periods. Grapes are often described as drought-tolerant once established, and that's true to an extent. They can survive dry conditions better than many fruit plants. But surviving and thriving are 2 different things. If you want those big, juicy clusters, your vines need consistent moisture, particularly from bloom time through fruit set and into early fruit development. This is when the berries are sizing up, and if they're water-stressed during this period, they'll stay small and the clusters will be loose and sparse. The trick is to water deeply, but infrequently. You want to encourage those roots to grow down deep into the soil where moisture is more stable. Shallow, frequent watering creates shallow root systems that are vulnerable to drought and heat. I usually recommend setting up a drip irrigation system if you've got more than a couple of vines, because it delivers water right to the root zone without wasting it on foliage or surrounding soil. Plus, it keeps the leaves dry, which helps prevent fungal diseases. If you're hand watering, give each vine a good, long drink once or twice a week during dry weather, making sure the water penetrates at least a foot deep. You can check by digging down with a trowel a few hours after watering to see how far the moisture has reached. As the grapes start to ripen and develop their colour, you can actually back off on watering somewhat. This helps concentrate the sugars in the fruit and can improve flavour. But during that critical early growth phase, don't let them get too dry. I've seen vines that looked perfectly healthy from a distance, but when you checked the soil, it was bone dry 6 inches down. Those vines produce clusters with berries the size of peas. Meanwhile, vines right next door with consistent watering had plump grapes that were easily twice the size. Now here's a tip that might seem small but makes a surprising difference: thinning your grape clusters. This is another one of those counterintuitive gardening practices where you're actually removing potential fruit to get a better harvest. When your vines set fruit in early summer, you'll often see multiple clusters forming on each shoot. It's tempting to leave them all because more clusters should mean more grapes, right? Not exactly. What happens when you leave every single cluster is that the vine struggles to feed them all adequately. You end up with many small, underdeveloped clusters instead of fewer but larger, higher quality ones. The general rule is to thin down to 1 cluster per shoot, sometimes 2 if the vine is very vigorous and healthy. This might feel wasteful at first, but trust the process. By removing some clusters early on, you're redirecting the plant's energy into the remaining fruit, which will grow bigger, ripen more evenly, and taste better. Commercial vineyards do this routinely because they know it's essential for quality. Lucas, a friend who has a small hobby vineyard, resisted cluster thinning for years because he felt like he was throwing away potential wine. But one year he decided to try it on half his vines as an experiment. The thinned vines produced clusters that were 50% larger, with berries that ripened a full 2 weeks earlier and had noticeably better sugar levels. He's been thinning religiously ever since. Timing matters here. You want to thin clusters fairly early, typically when the berries are about pea-sized. At that stage, the vine can still redirect resources effectively. If you wait too long, the benefit is reduced. Just walk along your vines, assess each shoot, and snip off the weaker or less developed clusters with clean pruning shears. It takes a bit of time, but the payoff in harvest quality is absolutely worth it. Let's talk about fertilization, because this is an area where more is definitely not better. As I mentioned earlier, grapes don't need heavy feeding, especially when it comes to nitrogen. What they do benefit from is balanced nutrition with attention to potassium and phosphorus, which support flowering, fruit set, and fruit development. A general approach is to apply a balanced fertilizer in early spring as growth begins, something like a 10-10-10 or similar ratio, but in modest amounts. You're aiming to support the vine without pushing excessive vegetative growth. Many experienced grape growers prefer to rely heavily on compost and organic mulches rather than synthetic fertilizers. A nice layer of well-aged compost spread around the base of your vines each spring provides slow-release nutrients and improves soil structure. You can also use aged manure, but make sure it's well composted, because fresh manure can burn roots and introduce weed seeds. Some growers swear by foliar feeding, spraying a dilute liquid fertilizer directly on the leaves during the growing season. This can give vines a quick boost and is especially helpful if you notice signs of deficiency like yellowing leaves. Pay attention to what your vines are telling you. If the leaves are deep green and growth is vigorous but you're not getting many grapes, you probably have too much nitrogen. Back off the feeding. If leaves are yellowing and growth is weak, you might need to add some nutrition or check your soil pH, because nutrient lockup can occur if pH is way off. Grapes are actually pretty good at communicating their needs if you know what to look for. One thing I always emphasize is the importance of proper training and support systems. Grapevines are vigorous climbers that will sprawl everywhere if you let them, and that sprawling mess is not good for fruit production. Your vines need a sturdy structure to climb on, a trellis, arbor, pergola, or wire system, and you need to train the canes to grow in an organized way. This isn't just about aesthetics, it's about air circulation, sunlight penetration, and making pruning and harvesting manageable. There are many training systems to choose from, and honestly, the best one depends on your space, your goals, and your grape variety. For backyard gardeners, a simple 4-arm niffin system or a high-wire cordon system works great. These systems involve establishing a main trunk that grows to a certain height, then training horizontal arms or cordons along wires in both directions. Your fruiting canes grow from these cordons and you prune them back each winter. The beauty of these systems is that they spread the vine out, allowing every cluster to get sun exposure and airflow. This reduces disease pressure and helps grapes ripen evenly. If you're growing grapes on an arbor or pergola, your training approach will be different, but the principles remain the same. Keep growth organized, ensure good light penetration, and don't let the vine turn into a tangled jungle. Ivy, a gardener I met at a workshop, had a beautiful grape arbor that provided wonderful shade over her patio, but her grape production was terrible for years. When I looked at it, the problem was clear. The canopy was so dense that sunlight couldn't reach most of the interior, and air circulation was poor. She started thinning out excess canes and training new growth more thoughtfully, and the very next year, her harvest doubled. Pest and disease management is another critical component of getting a great grape harvest. Grapes can be affected by various issues depending on your region: powdery mildew, downy mildew, black rot, Japanese beetles, grape berry moths, and birds, just to name a few. The good news is that with some proactive management, you can minimize these problems significantly without resorting to heavy chemical use. Powdery mildew is probably the most common issue for grape growers in many areas. It shows up as a white, powdery coating on leaves and fruit, and it thrives in warm, humid conditions with poor air circulation. This is why proper pruning and training are so important. They keep air moving through the canopy. You can also use sulfur-based fungicides, which are organic and quite effective when applied preventively. I spray my vines with a sulfur solution every couple of weeks during the growing season, starting when shoots are about 6 inches long. It's not foolproof, but it keeps mildew in check. Japanese beetles can be a nightmare in some regions, chewing up leaves and reducing the vine's ability to photosynthesize. Handpicking them early in the morning when they're sluggish is effective if you have just a few vines. For larger plantings, you might need to use an organic insecticide or beetle traps, though be careful with traps because they can sometimes attract more beetles than they catch. Birds are another challenge, especially as grapes ripen. They can strip your clusters clean in just a day or two. Netting is the most reliable solution. Drape it over your vines as the grapes start to show colour, and secure it well so birds can't sneak underneath. One of the most rewarding aspects of growing grapes is the learning curve. Every season teaches you something new about your specific vines and your specific conditions. Maybe you notice that one section of your trellis produces better than another because it gets an extra hour of afternoon sun. Or you discover that your vines need an extra watering during that hot week in July when temperatures spike. These little observations add up, and over time you develop an intuition for what your grapes need and when they need it. That's the beauty of gardening. It's a relationship that deepens with time and attention. Another thing to consider is timing your harvest correctly, because picking grapes at the right moment makes a huge difference in flavor and sweetness. Unlike some fruits that continue ripening after harvest, grapes stop developing sugar once they're picked. What you harvest is what you get. So how do you know when they're ready? Well, color is the first clue. Your grapes should have developed their full varietal color: deep purple for dark varieties, golden or pale green for white varieties, deep red for red varieties. But color alone isn't enough because grapes can look ripe before they actually are. The best test is taste. Start sampling grapes from different parts of your vine a week or two before you think they might be ready. Grapes near the bottom of clusters ripen first, and grapes on the sunny side of the vine ripen before those in shade. You're looking for a good balance of sweetness and flavour without too much tartness. Seeds should be brown rather than green. Another clue is that the stem holding each cluster, called the rachis, will turn from green to brown as the cluster fully ripens. If you're making wine or juice, you might even want to measure sugar content with a refractometer, but for eating fresh or making jam, your taste buds are the best guide. Don't be afraid to harvest clusters over a period of days rather than all at once. The beauty of home growing is that you're not running a commercial operation with deadlines. If some clusters are perfect today and others need another 3 days, harvest accordingly. This also spreads out your processing if you're making juice or jam, which can be a relief when you have a big harvest. Storage and handling after harvest matter too. Grapes are delicate and they don't keep as long as apples or citrus. Handle them gently to avoid bruising and refrigerate them promptly if you're not using them right away. They'll keep in the fridge for a week or two, depending on the variety. If you have more grapes than you can use fresh, consider freezing them, making juice, making jam or jelly, or even trying your hand at winemaking. Frozen grapes are amazing as a summer snack and work beautifully in smoothies. Grape juice is straightforward to make and can be canned or frozen for year-round enjoyment. Something that often gets overlooked is the first few years of establishment. Young grapevines need patience. In the first year, you should actually remove any flower clusters that form. I know that's hard to do when you're excited to get your first harvest, but letting a young vine fruit too early diverts energy away from root and shoot development. You want that vine to build a strong foundation. In the second year, you can let it produce a light crop, maybe just a cluster or two per vine. By the third year, your vines should be hitting their stride and producing good harvests. And from year 4 onward, you'll see consistent, heavy production if you've cared for them well. I think one of the great joys of growing grapes is how they transform a space. A well-grown grapevine isn't just a fruit producer, it's a beautiful architectural element in your garden. The twisted trunks, the broad leaves, the dangling clusters, they create this almost mythical atmosphere that connects you to thousands of years of human agriculture. Grapes are one of humanity's oldest cultivated plants, grown by ancient Egyptians, Greeks, and Romans. When you're pruning your vines or harvesting clusters, you're participating in that long tradition. There's something deeply satisfying about that. Let's circle back to something I touched on earlier but want to emphasize: the importance of variety selection not just for climate but for your intended use. If you're primarily interested in eating grapes fresh, you'll want varieties bred for table use, seedless types like Flame Seedless, Thompson Seedless, or seeded types like Concord if you don't mind seeds. These varieties are bred for sweetness, pleasant texture, and good eating quality. If you're interested in making wine, you'll want wine grape varieties like Chardonnay, Cabernet Sauvignon, Merlot for warmer climates, or cold hardy hybrids like Marquette, Frontenac, or La Crescente for cooler areas. Wine grapes tend to be smaller and more concentrated in flavor than table grapes. Juice and jelly grapes are often somewhere in between. Concord is a classic for this purpose, with its distinctive sweet tart flavor and beautiful purple color. Some people grow multiple varieties for different purposes, which is a great approach if you have the space. You could have a Concord vine for juice, a Flame Seedless for fresh eating, and maybe a Frontenac for experimental winemaking. Each adds something unique to your garden and your kitchen. Mulching is another practice that benefits grapevines tremendously. A good layer of organic mulch around the base of your vines, wood chips, straw, shredded leaves, helps retain soil moisture, suppress weeds, and moderate soil temperature. It also breaks down over time, adding organic matter to your soil. Keep the mulch a few inches away from the trunk itself to prevent moisture buildup against the bark, which can encourage rot and pest problems. Refresh the mulch layer each year and you'll notice your soil quality improving over time. Companion planting can also play a role in a healthy grape vineyard, though it's not as critical as with some other crops. Some gardeners plant clover or other low-growing nitrogen-fixing plants in the aisles between grape rows to add nitrogen to the soil and prevent erosion. Others plant aromatic herbs like oregano, thyme, or hyssop nearby, which can attract beneficial insects and potentially confuse pests. I've seen beautiful setups where grapevines are underplanted with strawberries or low-growing flowers, creating a productive and attractive space. Just make sure any companion plants aren't competing too aggressively for water and nutrients, especially in the first few years when your vines are getting established. As your vines mature, you might encounter the need for renovation. Sometimes an old vine that's been neglected or poorly pruned needs major corrective work. Don't be afraid to cut back hard to the main trunk and essentially start over with training new shoots. Grapevines are incredibly resilient, and they'll bounce back from severe pruning as long as the root system is healthy. I've seen vines that looked hopeless, gnarled, tangled messes producing almost nothing, transformed in just 2 or 3 years through aggressive renovation pruning and proper training. It takes patience, but it's very doable. One last thing I want to mention is the social aspect of grape growing. There's a wonderful community of grape enthusiasts out there, from casual backyard growers to serious amateur vintners. Joining a local gardening club, vineyard association, or online forum can be incredibly valuable. You'll learn from people who are growing in your specific climate and dealing with your specific challenges. You'll hear about varieties that work well locally, about pest management strategies that are effective in your region, and you'll make friends who share your passion. I've learned as much from casual conversations with other grape growers as I have from any book or website. So there you have it, 9 helpful tips for growing grapes and getting those bigger clusters and richer harvests. Choose the right variety for your climate and purpose. Plant in full sun with well-drained soil. Prune hard and consistently to focus the vine's energy on fruit production. Water consistently during key growth periods, especially from bloom through early fruit development. Thin your clusters to improve size and quality. Fertilize moderately, focusing on balanced nutrition rather than heavy nitrogen. Train your vines on a proper support system for light penetration and air circulation. Manage pests and diseases proactively with good cultural practices and preventive treatments. And finally, harvest at the right time by tasting and observing your grapes as they ripen. Each of these tips builds on the others, creating a comprehensive approach to grape growing that addresses the plant's needs at every stage. And remember, gardening is a journey, not a destination. Your first year might be a learning experience with modest results. Your second year will be better. By your third or fourth year, you'll have developed the knowledge and intuition to grow beautiful, abundant grapes that make all the effort worthwhile. There's nothing quite like walking out to your garden on a late summer morning, feeling the weight of those heavy clusters in your hand, tasting that perfect balance of sweetness, and knowing you grew them yourself. Grapes are generous plants. They want to produce for you. Your job is simply to give them the conditions they need, guide their growth in the right direction, and step back to let them do what they do best. When you approach grape growing with patience, observation, and a willingness to learn from both successes and failures, you'll be rewarded with years of beautiful harvests and the deep satisfaction that comes from working with these ancient, wonderful plants. Thank you so much for spending this time with me today here at Botanic Haven. I hope these tips inspire you to start growing grapes or to improve your existing vines. If you have questions, experiences to share, or your own tips that have worked well for you, please leave a comment below. I love hearing from fellow gardeners, and we all learn from each other. Until next time, happy gardening, and may your grape clusters be heavy, your harvest abundant, and your garden a source of endless joy.